Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to a live interview with none other than Mr. Mark Howard, who is the author. I have your books right next to me, actually, of Godfrey's Crusade, which is book one, and Godfrey Under Siege. And these covers, I love the covers. I love the blues. I think they're very pretty together. Welcome to my channel, Mark. Thank you so much for joining me. This is live, but obviously it will stay on my channel so people can watch it back as well. So we're going to talk about all things you and your books.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me so much here. It's something I've been thinking about for a really long time. Just the opportunity to have this interview here, so thanks for hosting me. I also really love the book covers there. No secret, blue is my favorite color. So when I was talking to my cover artist, it's like, of course, blue is going to work its way in.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the cover art is something that I always get these great compliments on, right? They say don't judge a book by its cover, but
Mm.
then what's the first thing we always look at, right? It's like the
Wow,
cover art.
exactly. And I think as well, like your covers are really good depictions of kind of what to expect. Like they already give that medieval vibe that we get throughout the book. And just, I love the lone figure because we do see Godfrey kind of, although he's always got people around him throughout the series, he is just kind of a man on his own a little bit, just trying to find his way through life and get through the next day.
Mhm. Yeah, very much so, right? Um, Godfrey is being of noble birth here, right? He's in a position of leadership, and there are characters who are loyal to him and characters who view him more as a rival. Um, but being in a leadership position is in many ways being alone,
Yeah.
right? And so
Well,
it's interesting to explore those power dynamics throughout the
mm.
books.
And he is relatively young in the grand scheme of things throughout this first book, especially. Obviously, I don't want to do any massive spoilers or anything because the main premise is to get people to read your books more. But he is quite young throughout this series. Was that always your intention to kind of have like a younger protagonist, or was it just something that happened?
So it was intentional here. I've spent most of my academic career learning medieval and ancient history, and one thing that would surprise a lot of us today is to learn how young certain famous characters were from history, and they were doing all these great things.
Mm,
Alexander the Great comes to mind, right, where he's uh, a king leading armies across the whole uh, of what would now be called Turkey and all the way into India. The guy died at age 33, and he had conquered almost all the known world at that point.
mm,
And so uh, I wanted a younger protagonist, partly to reflect some of those ancient world medieval realities there, but also I felt from a narrative perspective, a younger protagonist would help us learn about the setting a little bit more, right? Where the
mm.
younger protagonist, he's got questions about how the larger world around him works. And so I thought that that was a more natural way to answer some of those kind of expositional questions of the setting at large here.
Yeah, I do really like Godfrey's character. I think my favorite thing as well with the fact that he is a younger character is the fact that you get to watch him grow. Like he starts off as a squire right at the start of the book, and obviously he's uncertain of himself, and just watching his character arc even through the first book is really interesting. And even just thinking about people who would have gone through something like this. Obviously, this is more of a medieval fantasy, so there are fantastical elements involved, but if you go back to those times, people would have been very young on the battlefield and experiencing these things and fighting for those in power. So that was really interesting. Um, so with Godfrey being so young and obviously this world being medievally fantastical, where did that inspiration come from for the whole world? Because it's got plays on what I remember from learning about history as a kid, but with obviously different elements woven in as well.
Yeah, so I think history was one of the big motivators there, or one of the big inspirations, I should say, for this setting. I've always been a fan of fantasy and a fan of history at the same time. And as I was going through college and studying history in more depth, uh, I would read these fantasy books on the side here, and I would say, this is really neat, but that's not how things actually worked in medieval times.
Hmm.
And so, part of my mission, I guess, in writing these books was to still keep it a secondary world, right? Not just write a piece of historical fiction,
Mm.
but to insert a little bit of real medieval culture and a few elements from the ancient world into this quasi medieval setting here.
Mm.
Some other great sources of inspiration. When I was a teenager, I got involved in some fantasy role playing games like Dungeons and Dragons.
Yeah.
There were some video games I was playing, things like that, right? So that really shined through. And I think stepping back a moment here, what really got me into fantasy uh, to such a degree was I remember, I believe it was my first year of high school. Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies first hit theaters, right?
Hmm.
And I did not read the books beforehand, and so when I saw the Fellowship of the Ring in theaters, it really just knocked my socks off, right? It
Yeah.
blew me out of the water. I was just amazed at Tolkien's world and Peter Jackson's portrayal of it.
Mm.
And so before The Two Towers, before the second movie came out, I had already read all the Lord of the Rings books and The Hobbit and The Silmarillion, and I just consumed everything I could
Mm.
before that second movie came out. And I would say that I've been a pretty diehard fan of fantasy ever since then.
Yeah. I think that movie had a lot of inspiration for a lot of people. I mean, it had a lot of impact on me growing up, because my dad used to watch it a lot when I was younger, so it was probably one of the first high fantasy films that I ever experienced growing up, which then obviously must have led me to books somehow, as it does for most people. But I love that idea that a film can just spark so much love and inspiration back into a community, like just bringing loads of people together. And obviously Lord of the Rings is still massive now. It's not something that seems to have died down at all. It's on a steady incline of people coming to experience it. What would you say would be other inspirations for kind of drawing you into fantasy or just reading in general?
Um, I think to a large degree, there's an element of escapism there, right?
Mm.
Not in a bad way, right? Um, the reality of kind of our day-to-day lives is like, okay, we go to work, we go home, we sit in traffic in between, right?
Mm.
Most of us don't have a lot of real opportunities for grand adventures or to see these really out of the ordinary things. And so I think that we want we want entertainment in our lives, right?
Mm.
We want to see something outside of the ordinary to get us excited. Um, I also think that um, stories help teach values, right?
Yeah.
Where um, we want to find in these characters something worth emulating, some bad things to try to avoid. And
Mm.
so um, part of my inspiration was to tell stories where uh, the protagonist could be the good guy again, I guess.
Yeah.
Uh, I It was getting really popular, and it's still popular today, where a lot of people were writing these morally gray characters here for their protagonists, and that's fine, right?
Mhm.
But I also think that there's an underserved market of people who want the protagonist to be a generally upstanding guy.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to feed into that need there as well.
Which I think is done really well. Obviously, Godfrey, he seems to have like a very strong moral compass. He is driven to protect and to just do the best he can for his family, for his everyone, really. Bless his cotton socks. So it is he is dealt some strong blows within this book, and one of the arcs that I did also find interesting is the forbidden love kind of arc that you've got within this. Obviously, not going too much into it because I don't want to do any spoilers. But was that idea always interwoven into your story?
Yes. So from a very early point, right? We decided that okay, the story can't all be battles, right? I mean, there's some of us who really like the warfare side of things, and obviously my book caters to that pretty heavily. But even the biggest, baddest warriors out there have more to their characters than just this one aspect, right?
Mm.
And so. Most of us at some point in our lives find someone we're attracted to and want to romantically pursue. And with again, trying not to go into too many details here to avoid some spoilers, right? But I think a lot of stories, uh, they we need to have some sort of obstacle, right? Something to
Mhm.
get in the way of these two people from falling in love, right?
Yeah.
And in a lot of stories that I've read, they try to complicate this and they create the obstacle of the love triangle, right? Where we say, okay, I love this person, but this person isn't sure, right? There's someone else out there that maybe we are stuck between.
Mhm.
Um, and so, me looking back to uh, some more medieval archetypes for some of their love stories, I found that the parents can often be that obstacle there that
Yeah.
prevents them from falling in love and doing what they want there.
Mm.
And so, I wanted to lean more into that more medieval inspiration there. And so, going with the more forbidden love as opposed to the love triangle, I think that served as a more appropriate obstacle for that love interest, at
Mm.
least in this book.
I agree. I mean, I also personally am not a massive fan of the love triangle trope. But obviously, you've just mentioned about how there's plenty of battles within this book. How do you go about researching that sort of thing? How do you write a good battle?
Yeah, so a lot of this comes back to my degree, right? When I was in college and grad school, I read a lot on ancient and medieval warfare, right?
Mhm.
Everything from the weapons and armor to the kinds of tactics that they would use. It really comes down to lots and lots of reading, right?
Right.
And then the other element here is to try to think not just in terms of maybe these blocks of soldiers that you might see on a map where it shows like okay they flanked around to the left or
Mhm.
something like that or they hid behind the hill, but you also got to try to think of these battles not just in terms of like blocks of soldiers moving on some game board, but you imagine yourself in the shoes of one of these characters who is doing their best, following orders,
Mm.
but then they don't have this bird's eye view, right? They're in their own shoes here. And
Yeah.
so um and so yeah, you imagine uh the equipment you have, the training you have, the knowledge you have, and the knowledge you don't have.
Mm.
And I think that's what I try to put into the mix of writing what I think at least makes for a good battle scene.
Yeah, and to keep it as realistic as possible, it sounds.
Mhm.
Yeah, because a lot of you keep mentioning obviously history, and you're doing history as a is it an undergrad for you guys? Is that right?
Yeah, yeah. So in the in U.S. higher education, um, your undergraduate is encompasses everything up to a bachelor's degree.
Right.
Your first 4 years of college, that's not to get too far into that stuff, right? But if you're to get a bachelor's degree, that's considered undergraduate work.
Hmm.
And then the next step up is a master's degree and then a PhD, which is what we call graduate school over here.
Ah, okay, yeah. So that kind of follows similarly to what we have over here in the UK. So, what made you choose history as an undergrad?
Um, so I think I've always had an interest in history to a large
Mm,
degree. Um, we in my family growing up, I was told stories about famous ancestors who did certain things, and so that interest was always there,
mm,
and it tied into my interest in fantasy, right? Because a lot of fantasy has some crossover with
mm,
particularly the medieval time period, and so it seemed like uh, a natural extension where uh, where my education and my personal interests had just a lot of overlap there.
mm,
And I also found that some of the other classes that were not history related, I took a couple of business classes, for instance, and I found that those courses were not nearly as interesting or challenging.
mm.
I found with a couple of business courses I took that I didn't need to open the textbook once and could still get perfect grades practically in that. And
Yeah.
so I felt that my time spent in history was far more worthwhile.
Yeah, and obviously it's come to a really good purpose because you've got the bones to start writing Godfrey, which is impressive. Um, did you going past your undergrad slightly? Maybe I don't really know where this falls into your timeline, but have you always wanted to be a writer, or how did that kind of come about in your life?
So I had been dabbling in writing from a very early age. Um, when I was in the U.S. schools, we call this first grade, so ages
Mm,
like 6 to 7. I remember one of my teachers giving us a creative writing assignment, and the creative writing assignment only needed to be 1 page long, which for a 6 or 7 year old, that's still
a
a
lot.
bit on the longer side there, right? Um, well, I came back with a 5 page story,
Oh wow.
and yeah, I don't know what happened to that story. But I do remember my teacher being very impressed with it at the time and saying, "Wow, you're
Mm,
going to be a writer someday." And that I didn't take it terribly seriously at the time, but I had
yeah.
always been tinkering with it, jotting down a few ideas, and by the time I graduated high school here, uh, I had gotten more serious about what I wanted to do with my life as an adult. And so it started coalescing into a lot more solid picture at that point.
Mm. And then did Godfrey is it something that you've developed over many, many years? Is it an idea that has been more recent? How did Godfrey come about?
So my first iteration of Godfrey actually uh, came up during my freshman year of college. Uh, I found myself bored one day while I was studying in the library, and on my laptop, I just started typing this scene of a knight in a duel with a vampire. Very much fantasy there,
Yeah.
and it's that particular scene has changed forms quite radically there. Not to
Mm.
spoil us on, but you know from reading the book that that's kind of in there still.
Yeah.
It looked very, very different in that first iteration, but some of the key concepts have been there for a long time, and they've just developed and have been refined as the years have gone on.
Yeah. And then obviously this is published independently. Was that always the plan? Have you tried to go traditional? Do
Um,
you prefer indie?
so Yeah, yeah. So this is a really interesting question here,
Mm,
and one that deserves a full answer. So, in when I had first completed my manuscript, right? I had uh, finished all the way from chapter one to the end of chapter 25. I
mhm.
had gone through uh, the a professional editor, had it looked over, and it in both my mind and my editor's mind and the beta feedback I got, everyone was saying this is good enough to be published, right?
Mhm.
And so at first, I was looking for a traditional publishing deal. Um, we know of several famous authors out there who just received rejection after rejection after rejection
Yeah.
until finally someday after 20 rejections a publisher just happens to like the manuscript and voila, dreams come true, right?
Yeah.
um, and so I was seeking out a traditional publishing deal uh, with that in mind, like, okay, there's going to be a lot of rejection, but that doesn't mean your story's not bad. You just got to keep going, right?
Mhm.
Um, but I also set some certain limits on how far I would take that avenue, right?
Yeah.
Because in, oh gosh, early 2020, 2021, um, things were looking very bleak for first time authors trying to get that traditional publishing deal, right?
Yeah.
Um, Publishers have grown far more conservative with who they let through the gate.
Mm.
And so uh, the there's a bit of an irony here too. It's never been easier to type out a story and to get it ready to be published, but it's
Mhm.
also never been harder to get noticed, right?
Right.
And so, anyway, long story short, after about a year of looking through for a traditional publishing deal, it just wasn't materializing. In fact, um, I had submitted to one larger press who they wanted a physical copy of the manuscript mailed to them, right? Physically mailed, which is kind of rare these days, but
Mhm.
that's what they wanted. And I sent the package to them, and it was returned to me unopened,
Oh.
saying that the address was wrong. And I was a bit disappointed in that because this package had been sitting in the mail for several months, right?
Hmm.
But which is an outrageously long time for the US mail system for something to not be delivered, but also not be returned to you. So I
Right.
got that back and I double checked the address on the publisher's website. And lo and behold, in the interim of me sending this package and getting it back, this publisher's mailing address had changed.
Oh.
And so what are you to do except for strike out the old address, put on the new address,
Yeah.
and send it again, right? Well, it sits in the mail for another about 6 months or so.
Mm.
I get it back and it's still unopened.
That's odd. Surely.
Right, right. And so having gone through that experience and having had numerous other rejections, I said, well, forget this. I'm just going to publish it on my own.
Mm. Well, why not? I mean, I feel like years ago there was and a lot of people talk about it, a stigma with indie books because they were seen as potentially lesser. Whether they were or not is obviously up to debate. But the idea of being indie was just, it was not seen as great as being traditionally published. Whereas I'm glad now that doesn't seem to be the case. People are realizing that authors that go indie, obviously everyone cares about their books and stuff, but you guys obviously have more control over your process, your marketing, everything that you choose to do. So would you say that overall it may have been a better decision to go indie?
I think so in a lot of ways
Mm,
here, especially for the reasons that you've suggested here. The publishing industry has seen some interesting shifts, right? Where, as I mentioned earlier, it's never been easier to publish, particularly self-publish here. Um, and it's allowed for a lot of new kinds of stories to be written that we might not have been able to see in the past, right?
mhm.
And it has allowed for that greater degree of control on the author's part to see his or her vision really come to fruition there.
Mm,
And so there's far few gatekeepers in that regard.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, so.
And how have you, because obviously you've got an audiobook as well, which for indie authors is still quite rare 'cause they're quite pricey, I can imagine. How
Yeah.
did you find that process, and was that always an aim to have an audiobook?
Um, yeah, so it was not on my radar at first when I very
Mm,
first published, but um, as I was very first beginning to market my book, I had it out as an ebook and I had it out as a paperback,
mhm.
but I was also getting lots of questions from the very beginning of when is the audiobook version coming out? And so I knew that there was a fairly high demand
Mm,
for it from the beginning. And so I knew right away that, okay, I'm going to need to save up some funding here to make this happen because
mm.
there's a there's a growing market, and it seemed like on social media for almost a year straight, everyone was asking, when's the audiobook coming out?
But that's nice to have, surely, having people go, "We want the audiobook."
Oh yeah, yeah. It's a great thing, and it took me a while to find the right narrator for this project.
Mhm.
Um, but one really special thing the narrator did here, Dylan Wheeler is his name, a phenomenal voice actor, among other things. And as I was listening to Godfrey's Crusade
Mhm.
for feedback here for QA control, I guess,
Yeah.
as I'm listening to him do these different character voices, I was personally getting really excited for what is he going to make this character sound like? How is this character going to sound, I should
Yeah.
say. And so he brought these different voices to these different characters, which just helped it come alive a little bit more in my mind.
Yeah, it's definitely a great audiobook. That's how I read it, thankfully. Well, thankful to you, obviously, because you very kindly gifted me a code, which thank you again for that. It is a great audiobook. I agree, the narrator really does do something great with the book. Um, it I can't imagine how much pressure it could be in order to like make sure you're picking the right person to bring your book to life, because you must have had some idea in your head how certain characters sounded or how they would talk. How did you have to do auditions for your narrator?
Um, so there was a little bit of a vetting process here, um, but I also fundamentally believe that um, it's better to let fellow creatives bring their expertise to the fore
Yeah.
than to have me try to micromanage something that I have more limited experience with, right?
Yeah.
And I found that this applies just as well to the audiobooks as well as to the cover art, right?
Hmm.
Um, like for instance, I could uh, go to my cover artist and say, okay, we did the sword a little bit too short. Can we make it longer? We could get really nitpicky about some of these
Yeah.
details. And then this changes from something everyone is really excited for to something that people start dreading a little bit, right?
Yeah.
Uh, when you get a little bit too nitpicky with certain things.
Mm.
And so I will say that with the audiobook, uh, even though I was really excited for most character voices, a couple did turn out not worse than what I wanted, but a little bit different than what I was expecting.
Yeah.
And I I kind of with one particular character, there's this goblin character who turned out the voice actor did something fairly different than what I was expecting,
Mhm.
and I kind of sat back and I did a little heavy sigh, and I thought to myself, "Is this what I want? Is this not
Mm.
what I want?" But I said, "You know what? This is his interpretation of it, and it works." So.
Yes, I agree. I think he has done a very, very good job on the audiobook. Is there plans for more audiobooks in the future? Obviously, you've already released Godfrey Under Siege in paperback and ebook. Is that something that you're looking to do?
Yes, I fully intend to get every novel that I produce on audiobook.
Hmm.
It's I've got some funding set aside for getting the second audiobook produced. I'm waiting a few more months to get the rest of the funding acquired for it,
Mm.
but that is a plan to get the second book on audio, and then from there, the plan will be finish writing the third book, release the third book on audio, write the
Yeah.
fourth book, get the fourth book on audio. And
Mhm.
so I do intend to eventually have the full series out on audio as well.
And have you seen like a positive uptake in not necessarily reviews because I know they're really hard to track, but just in people acquiring your book since you've had an audiobook?
I would say there has been at least the first month of having the audiobook released, there was a very large uptick in sales. For the audiobook in particular, I think it more than doubled my paperback and ebook sales
Mm.
for that first month. It tapered off a bit here in the second month of it being out, which I
Yeah.
think is to be expected to a certain degree, right? We've
Mhm.
had a lot of people that were waiting for the audiobook for a long time.
Yeah.
They snatched it up right away, and maybe now we're more in a phase of generating new interest.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I would say that it was a very worthwhile experience getting it on audiobook,
Mm.
and I'm hoping that sooner than later there's going to be a very big payoff for having it available in all these different formats.
Yeah, and I think it also goes to show how reading is changing as well. Obviously, during the pandemic and all of those fun things, I feel like a lot of people I know were picking up more books physically because you were actually able to sit and read, or a lot of people bought Kindles because they actually could sit and read and just immerse themselves in worlds. And I know me, especially now that I'm back to working full time and doing commutes and stuff, audiobooks are the way forward because you're able to just listen to them wherever you are. I think that's also a really a really positive change within just the book community as a whole is that now a lot of authors, I know it's easier for traditional authors probably to get these audiobooks, but even within the indie community, people are actually producing audiobooks for those that may not even have time to read like physically, or just only have the time to dedicate to reading when they're walking or preferring that way to read, which is really nice. And it means that you get a lot more inclusivity within your audience as well, which I think is really nice to see. So obviously we've spoken about first book, second book. How many books are planned for the Godfrey series? Or do you
Uh,
is that planned yet, or do we know?
so I currently have 5 books planned in total here,
Mhm.
and the I will put a caveat there that uh, it started off as just a standalone book, right? Godfrey's
Mhm.
Crusade initially was uh, just going to be one book, and then leaving it open to the possibility of future sequels, right?
Yeah.
Which I think is a good move for a lot of authors, right?
Yeah.
I think that uh, it might be unfair to the audience in some way to basically write half of a story, put it in one book, and then say, well, if you want to know how it ends, you've got to buy book 2 and 3 and all that, right?
Yeah.
And so I wanted to write my first book as a complete story that you could enjoy And if you wanted to read further along for sequels, that was going to be a possibility there. But after I got such a positive reception to the first book, I did say, okay, now we're for sure going to write a sequel here. And I then envisioned it as a trilogy.
Mm.
But then as I finished writing the second book, again, trying to be spoiler free here, but the second book is a lot more intense. There's some dark things that happen, and it's I was talking to a friend about writing the third book and how this would be the end of the trilogy. And I guess with the momentum being cranked up so high for the second book,
Mm.
we felt that, okay, we're already at this really high tense point.
Yeah.
Maybe we need to space out the things for the ending a little bit more. And so then we said, okay, we'll space out some of these ideas. Some will happen in the third book, some will happen in the fourth, and then the fifth will be the conclusion of this story arc.
Yeah.
That may still be subject to change,
Mm-hmm.
but that's the current plan is 5 books for this series. But even with that said, I think there's lots of room for other spin-off series, right? I've written a fairly large immersive setting, and there is definitely room for other characters to be developed and other stories to fill this world with.
Mm. And it's a very vast world. I think one of my favorite things about a lot of fantasy is that the worlds are so vast, and they kind of have to be, because especially if you want your characters to traverse goodness knows how far to go on quests and stuff as well, they need to be this kind of vast world. But with Godfrey's arc throughout the whole 5 books, I'm not too sure if you're a planner or a pantser. Does
I
he grow up a lot? Like, is it over a long period of time? Is that the plan, or is it kind of quite close together? Not to get
um
spoilers, but I'm intrigued.
so right, yeah. So chronologically, I think it's going to take place over the course of roughly 5-ish years,
Okay.
as far as the chronology goes.
Hmm.
But with that said, there's definitely a lot of room for character development, character growth.
Hmm.
Um, so again, it's hard not to just reveal all the little spoilers
I
throughout
mean,
all this, right?
you can if you
But
want, but
but so I think with a lot of stories, right? We talked a little bit about the love interest here a little while
Mhm.
ago, and a lot of stories, I think the conclusion of the romance subplot is when they finally really get together, right? They get
Yeah.
married happily ever after, the end.
Mhm.
What I want to do with Godfrey's story is to continue beyond the marriage, right? To show in the later books some of the newlywed life
Mhm.
and raising a young family amidst all kinds of other struggles and turmoil.
Yeah.
And so uh, there's definitely going to be uh, a lot of maturing that happens in Godfrey's character
Mm.
between his first book of him being an older teenager, growing into manhood, uh, getting married, and then taking on family responsibilities, in addition to being this crusading knight that has to go try to save the world from dragons and whatnot.
Yeah, which I mean, we love the crusading though.
Oh yeah, that's definitely not going to stop, right? It's a I think that um, physical conflict is something that excites us for a number of reasons, right? If for no other reason than the stakes are super high, right?
Mhm.
Where it's literal life or death for someone. And so my setting is a fairly dangerous world, right? There's definitely no shortage of monsters to tackle here. And so that's going to continue throughout.
That's That's interesting to hear. And I like the idea of obviously him arcing and growing up within his arc, which is quite nice to see because sometimes you have series and they just take place over the span of essentially a year, but you've still got multiple books within it because they've got all of these obstacles. But I think interweaving that real life aspect into whatever he ends up getting himself into as well is also just added pressures, and I think that's also really relatable. I feel like there's that part of the fantasy community just being relatable is a really key aspect, seeing yourself in characters and just kind of experience things that although they may be fighting a dragon, they also have these issues that you yourself might have, which really helps bring in an audience. Is there anything that you've read or watched that has made you feel like that and is potentially an added inspiration as well?
Yeah, so kind of circling back to the Lord of the Rings films, right?
Mm,
I remember the character Boromir being heroic in a certain sense, right? But
yeah.
also uh, he has weaknesses, right? He tries to take the ring from Frodo, and he immediately recognizes that it's a mistake, and he feels really badly about it.
Mhm.
But he's not without those flaws, right?
Yeah.
And so um, what I wanted to portray uh, in all of my characters is they have these ideals that they are striving for, right? Some of them doing better about that than others,
Yeah.
but um, but they also deal with uh, real questions and uncertainties, right? Um, one one thing that is a prominent theme in my book is religion, right?
Mhm.
And uh, even though in this setting, no one questions whether or not the gods are real,
Yeah.
they definitely have a lot of questions about, well, what are the gods trying to tell me, right? What is the meaning of this prophecy over here?
Yeah.
And I think that for a lot of the audience that has faith
Mm.
in a religion or something to that effect, I think that that's very relatable. Where they say, "Okay, I believe in the divine,
Mm.
but how do I know what the divine wants me to do?"
Well, exactly, and that's when you start looking for signs or prophecies, like you've mentioned, which again is a very big theme within fantasy. Just in general, there's not always, that's a little bit too broad, but there tends to be a fantasy or a religion throughout, obviously kind of showcasing things that we ourselves experience in normal everyday life, which is really interesting. Do you think that that will stay as prominent throughout the rest of the books for you?
Um, I think so. I think that uh, in our world today, we've gotten very well at separating religion from every other aspect of our lives, right?
Hmm.
But kind of drawing back more on this ancient and medieval mindset, religion is a daily experience for those people, and I want to continue to reflect that, where people do turn to religion on a daily basis, seeking answers to their problems, trying to figure out what the right thing to do is.
Mm.
Um, and it's just a really fascinating topic here. One of my inspirations for how I do prophecies in my stories
Mm.
is is more of this, more inspired by the Oracle of Delphi than, say, more of a Judeo-Christian tradition here, right?
Hmm.
You find in the Judeo-Christian tradition, when there's a prophecy given, you either do what God wants you to, or you're punished, right? And
Yeah.
there's very little room for in between there, right? But in the Greco-Roman tradition, uh, the oracle will give a prophecy, but then you have to be smart enough to figure out what the oracle actually meant when she gave it.
Yeah.
And so I loved that idea of teasing out the right answer between multiple interpretations of what did the goddess mean when she said this or that, right?
Mm. Oh, that's really interesting. And I think, excuse me, yeah, I really love that idea of religion, especially in my fantasy books sometimes, because they just kind of bring almost like a different spin on things. And from your books that are very clearly researched and you know a lot about this sort of time period of which it's set, I think that's also really prevalent within these books, because it just shows that you haven't just gone, oh, I'm going to pick this time period and hope it's kind of the same. You've clearly done a lot of research and are interested in the subject, which really comes through within your books.
Mhm. Yeah, there's, we see this online a lot where someone says, "Oh, it's fantasy," right? And they kind
Mm,
of use that as kind of this blow off excuse of poor writing or poor world building, right? Where uh, not to pick on any one franchise in particular, right? But Star Wars has gotten kind of guilty of this through the years, right? As
yeah,
more creators have dabbled into the franchise, there's been some inconsistencies and some contradictions. And some of the more hardcore fans will say like, "Oh, well, that's different from what happened over here," and
yeah,
do these writers care? And people will defend that by saying, "Oh, it's just fantasy, right? Just don't worry about the details."
yeah.
And I I feel that that's kind of a lazy excuse,
Hmm.
right? Where where I'm trying to go back to uh, something that is more well researched, but something that at the end of the day, it's my name on the cover of these books. I want to be proud of these, right? And
Yeah.
uh, so I want to put out something that I feel that I've done the absolute best that I can on it,
Mm.
right? Will there still be flaws? Absolutely, right?
Wow.
There are some things that after I finished reading my first book all the way through, I had the paperback in hand and I started reading. I'm like, did I write that? Right? We're our own worst critics, right?
Oh,
Um,
100%. Yeah, I say it all the time that there is nothing that anyone else can say to me that I have not already said to myself or said worse, which is quite
mhm,
sad in a way, but it is true, especially if you are a perfectionist or just any trait of that. It's one of those things that will forever haunt you in a sense, because you'll go back 5 years time, once the hot or however long, once the series finished, and you'll probably look at the first book and you go, but look how much better the final book is, or whatever you're writing next, which I think is really
mhm,
good. And I also bear that in mind a lot as well when reading series, whether they're completed or just going through. It's like you have to allow your author to find their stride within their story, and it can happen in 10 pages, it can happen in 50. Like, it depends, but as long as the story and the characters are engaging, depending what kind of a reader you are. Obviously, there are readers out there that are for the plot, there are readers out there for the characters, or a amalgamation of both. And as long as that is interesting to you, I think that is what will propel you forward to find that stride with the author as well, which is a key thing, because especially in these books that have got your longer series planned, you're not going to throw all the information, or you'd like to think you're not going to have all of
mhm,
the information thrown at you within the first 5 minutes, because then it's just too much to take in. I like that within Godfrey's Crusade, we learn as we go. There's no info dumping anywhere. There's no, well, this is because of this, just because. Like, there is reasons and like padding almost around every point, which is really helpful. And going into that, are you a planner in that sense? Did you plan the whole book or the whole series, or are you kind of like a pantser in a lot, in the sense that obviously you kind of know where your endpoint is, but as you have to write it to get there.
Uh, so I will say that um, I have become more of a planner as time has gone on, right?
Right.
Um, as I was dabbling in writing in my younger years, and I was maybe a little less serious about it, it was
Mm.
easy enough to just jot down a scene and then say, "Oh, it's all in my head. I'll come back to it later," and then just come back to it the next day or next week or whatever, and just pick up right where I left off.
Yeah.
Well, responsibilities of adult life have grown a lot more over time,
Mhm.
and so uh, as I was writing Godfrey's Crusade, I quickly discovered that I couldn't just wing it, right?
Mm.
That there had to be some sort of plan in place for me to, at minimum, remember the good ideas I had of what was going to happen in the next chapter or the two chapters from there or the very end of the book.
Yeah.
And so I, uh, I stopped writing Godfrey's Crusade very briefly just to get a brief outline, like chapter by chapter. Okay, here's what's going to happen in chapter 7. Here's what's going to happen in chapter 8, right?
Mhm.
And um, after I did all that, I went back to writing at like chapter 5 or 6 or something like that, and I continued throughout. But uh, as time went on, I was in the middle of my master's program, and it was taking a very long time to write Godfrey's Crusade. Right, it took a
Mhm.
total of 5 years before it was actually ready to be published, and I found that some of my ideas were changing from
Mm.
what was down in the outline. Um, and so I did a bit of a reassessment where I said, okay, here's where we're going, but do I like that idea as much as what's actually in the outline?
Yeah.
And so I started revising that outline as I went. And I feel that uh, my outlines serve, from that experience, I learned that my outlines serve as good guideposts,
Mhm.
but to still treat them as guideposts, and that it's perfectly fine to deviate from that to a certain extent, right? Or maybe even
Yeah.
just, uh, I don't know, I ended up scrapping the original ending I had for Godfrey's Crusade entirely. And the ending that actually made it in there, I feel is a lot better.
Mm.
And it's actually because I didn't follow my outline, right? So,
But giving yourself that allowance of being like, well, at least this is where I want everything to go, sounds like it really helped, obviously, because at least then you can be like, okay, this doesn't really feel like it needs to go the way that I've planned, or I actually need it to go a different way in order to get to my end goal. So giving yourself that almost freedom to do both is probably a really good mix, if I'm honest.
yeah, yeah. And back to the earlier point that you made about there not being a lot of info dumping, right? And that
Yeah.
everything seems really relevant. Uh, I I actually picked this up from no one less than Aristotle, right? I read Aristotle's Poetics on what he felt made for a good story, right? And he's
Mhm.
got this list of 6 things that he feels uh, should uh sorry, in order of what he feels should make for a good story, right? And the
Mhm.
number one thing he lists is plot, right?
Yeah.
What are the characters doing? What's actually happening in the story? And right behind that is the characters,
Mm.
right? We want to read about interesting people doing interesting things, right?
Yeah.
If we're not invested in our characters, then it almost doesn't matter what they're doing, or vice versa, right? We could have a really interesting character, but if that interesting character isn't doing something interesting, well, maybe they're not really all that interesting, right?
Yeah.
And so I kind of used that hierarchy for deciding what the actual contents of my story should be, right? And
Mhm.
so at its core, it's about interesting people doing interesting things, right?
Yeah.
And the world building, it fleshes out as the plot requires it, right?
Yeah. I like that as well. Like There are some books that I get on with really well that have obviously more information kind of not necessarily just dumped in one place, but just spoken to you throughout, expecting you to know things. And I think a common theme for a lot of these big epic fantasies as well is I'm going to be confused at least for the first 50% of the first book at least. So I think it's quite nice to not have that within the first book of a series, and for it also to be, it is a very manageable first book size as well for a fantasy, which is nice because
Mhm.
obviously a lot of these big epics are 600 plus pages long, and for someone like me who can be a who is not can be is a slower reader, having a approachable first book, I'm more likely to obviously dive into a series with an approachable first book, and then they can get steadily bigger after that because I'm invested. I want to know
Mhm.
more. And was that always the plan for you? Obviously, the first book is 400 something pages, and then Godfrey Under Siege is a little bit bigger. Is the plan to just kind of keep going bigger?
Um, I don't know if there's strictly a plan to continuously get bigger as we go on. I
Hmm.
think my main concern is telling a complete story.
Yeah,
Um, and if that complete story takes a little longer to take, then it takes a little longer. If it wraps up and it's a little bit shorter than the last book, it's like, well, it's a little bit shorter than the last book, right?
yeah,
Because I'm not one to throw in a bunch of stuff that I feel is unnecessary, right? Again, kind of going back to Aristotle here. It's like, let's focus on the plot, let's focus on the characters, and then everything else kind of trickles down after that, right?
yeah.
Um, Now, I do think just kind of peering ahead here, right? As I'm writing my third book, we do have a growing cast of characters, right?
Hmm.
And their interactions are becoming more complex. And so I think that the third book will probably end up being a bit longer to get to
Yeah.
that satisfying conclusion,
Hmm.
and maybe the fourth and fifth book as well as time goes on there.
Yeah.
Um, but I'm not going to hold myself to an arbitrary word count and say, okay, well, Godfrey Under Siege was 120,000 words long. The next
Hmm.
one better be 140,000 or else, right?
Yeah, which is a good way to be. You will tell the story in however much space you need, which is really nice. Obviously these ones are set in the medieval times. If there was another time period that you would choose to write another series in, do you have a preference, or is medieval like your thing?
Um, so medieval is where my strongest research is in, right?
Hmm.
Medieval and ancient world. So I could very comfortably go farther back on the timeline.
Hmm.
Um, but I also have a few strong feelings about um, progressing the timeline forward too far.
Yeah.
Um, I think that once gunpowder gets into the mix, we're kind of entering a different realm. Now, that
Hmm.
being said, fantasy is very, very broad and you can do
Yes.
whatever you want with it, right?
Mm.
In fact, I do make the argument that science fiction is a subgenre of fantasy. That
Mm.
maybe that's a whole discussion for another day there. But I know in terms of my own preferences, at least,
Mm.
I prefer to keep things uh, more in a pre-black powder kind of realm. If for no other reason than I'm mostly interested in exploring things that are different from today, right? Some
Yeah.
people, they really like their settings to be a reflection of the world they live in.
Hmm.
Uh, that doesn't excite me nearly as much as going into feudalism and crusading and these things that to us today we're a little bit they're a little more foreign to us. And
Mm.
I don't know. I just I really love diving into that stuff.
Yeah. So I'm not obviously you're writing book three for Godfrey. There's five books planned. Would you say that maybe if you were to write another series, it would stay within this same time period? Not necessarily this same world, but this same time period?
Um, I think that That's a very strong possibility. I
Hmm.
also think that uh, there's room to go back to, say, something more akin to a Bronze Age setting,
Okay.
or yeah, or possibly a classical Greek and Rome setting there. I've recently been, speaking of audiobooks, I've been listening to the Iliad and the Odyssey, and most recently the Aeneid with
Yeah.
my wife on audiobook, because she's never had the chance to delve into those before.
Hmm.
And so um, I've, my own interests have more recently leaned into kind of these Bronze Age epic poetry kind of stuff there.
Yeah.
And so if you were to ask me to start a new series right now that was not related to Godfrey, it's like, well, I could do Aeneas on another adventure, right? We there's some great stories in
Yeah.
that stuff there. It's the classics are generally another big source of inspiration for me, right?
Hmm.
Um, there's a reason why, we're still reading this stuff
Yeah.
2,500 years after they were first written down.
Hmm. Well, it seems to be a good inspiration for a lot of authors actually, because well, everyone gets their inspiration from different things, but the idea of obviously going back into our histories and traditions and myths and stuff is really interesting. And there's so much that you can do. Like there are so many authors that have probably told roundabout a very similar story over and over again, but people are still
Mhm.
buying these books because people have got different takes on them, or they mix it up with a different genre or something, which is really interesting. And I'd love to read, like, if you wrote a Bronze Age book, like that sounds really interesting. I think recently as well it's been more of a experiencing historical fiction and kind of branching out slightly from my normal fantasy that I've been reading, which is really nice. There's been a lot of authors recently, to my knowledge, who are bringing out these books that are inspired by like myths or things that happened in our history, which is really interesting. And yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what comes next for you, definitely.
Yeah. No, there's definitely a lot more stories to tell,
Yeah.
both in Godfrey's setting and in other places within the chronology of this world, and maybe even outside of this eventually, right?
Hmm.
One exciting thing that uh, I haven't really gone into much detail yet is my wife is actually writing a prequel series to my own works here.
Yeah.
And I've been working with her a lot on uh, this story that is set during the fall of the Elf Empire, right?
Hmm.
There's a few vague references to that in my published works so far about, the elves had this empire and
Hmm.
now it's gone and everything's a little worse because it's gone, right? And so my wife is or she is currently working on uh, the first book in her series, which is dealing with some of Godfrey's ancestors who are going through those calamitous collapse of the empire kind of events.
And how's that been working with your wife? I'm guessing you came up with the world of Godfrey by yourself, and then is it uh sounds like it's
So
going to be like a collaborative
yeah,
extent.
there's been a certain degree of collaboration. My wife and I, we have both had an interest in writing from a very early age.
Mhm.
Uh, she she was talking when we very first got married. She was talking about writing about this series of dragon riders, and I I'm not one to be super discouraging or anything, but I
Mhm.
also said, there's a lot of dragon riders out there, right?
Yeah.
This was well before House of the Dragon came out, even, right?
Yeah.
Um, but uh, so we talked about it a little bit, and I said, well, what's something else that they can ride? That is still a fantastical creature
Mm.
that would still be present that level of what's the word I'm looking for here? Majesty, I guess. Right?
Yeah.
Dragons are these very majestic creatures,
Mhm.
um, and so we settled on griffins actually, and so she she is writing a story in my setting set, a few centuries before my books actually take place,
Yeah.
but it's going to be about these Griffin riders here, which are Godfrey's ancestors, and Godfrey actually on his coat of arms actually depicts a griffin
Yes.
on it, right? Kind of in recognition of what his ancestors did in the distant past there.
That's so interesting. And it must be I don't know, probably positives and negatives to working with your spouse, I'm guessing. It would be if it was me and my spouse anyways.
Mhm.
But I think that's just a lovely thing to be able to like share and build on. Does that mean that in future Godfrey books you may be referring back to that series as well?
So there actually already has been a couple references because my
Mhm.
wife hasn't published her stuff yet. It's a little harder to see, but
Right.
with the in the very first book, there is Godfrey meets this elf character, right?
Yes, he does.
Well, kind of stereotypical elves, right? We went with elves that are really long lived. Well, this
Mhm.
particular elf that Godfrey meets, briefly in my book, is actually a more central character in my wife Summer's books. And
Oh,
so you'll get to meet him in greater detail. You'll get to know him in greater detail there.
oh, that's really cool. So then if readers go back and because a lot of things that people do is obviously as books come out, they'll go back and reread, especially if there's been a large gap for them between experiencing books. Then, if they manage to read the prequel series in between one of your releases and go back to reread, they'll be able to pick those things out, which is almost like an Easter egg hunt as well, which is really cool.
Yeah, yeah, and we're sharing the same maps that we're using, right? Because it's the same setting, and so certain locations are going to come up again,
Hmm.
and yeah, there will be references in my books to things that are happening in her books and whatnot, and yeah, it's been an overall really positive experience
Oh, that's
working with her.
yeah,
Right there are a certain degree of creative differences, right? Where
yeah.
I might want to do things one way and she might want to do things another way. But I have to remind myself that, she has her own voice and her own stories that she wants to tell in this
Hmm.
setting. And so uh, while we may have a few minor creative differences there, it's important to not micromanage like we were talking about earlier, right?
Yeah.
With some of these things like cover artists and narrators, where it's like uh, let them bloom and grow in their own little corner of the sandbox, right?
And does she have plans to publish anytime soon with her novels, or is that still
Uh,
like a work in progress?
yeah, it's more a work in progress here. Uh, she's almost done with the first draft. I think it's taken a lot longer than either of us were anticipating,
Hmm.
but she's getting close to a second draft now. I think after she goes through two or three drafts, then we'll do some beta feedback and we'll go through things with a fine tooth comb,
Hmm.
and then after that, professional editing, and then it just all goes from there. But we're getting a lot closer. We actually we have a meeting scheduled with now our cover artist, right? Was my cover artist, but now we're using the same guy here, Jeff Brown.
Yeah.
He's great. But yeah, we'll be having a meeting with him in February, and
Oh, wow.
so she'll have some cover art to show off here pretty soon for her book.
Oh, that's really interesting. So obviously, for people who are watching now or watching back later, make sure that you are following Mark on social medias so that he can actually share that with you. And then obviously, I'm guessing she'll promote because, to my knowledge, I don't follow her on anything. But I'm guessing once
Yeah, her
that all
social media
starts,
presence right now is exceptionally small.
yeah,
I think and I was kind of in the same boat here before I had published anything, right? I
yeah,
said to myself, well, gosh, what am I gonna share with no one who cares about me because I don't have a book out yet, right?
yeah,
So I think that right now she doesn't really have a strong social media presence because, well, there's not a lot to show yet.
yeah. But there
But
will be.
yeah, but there will be. And
Yeah,
so, if nothing else, I'm trying to lay some groundwork for her, right? Like, hey, if you like my stuff, maybe you'll like Summer Howard's stuff when it comes
yeah.
out.
Well,
So,
exactly. And the thing is, like, obviously, I'm sure you'll be sharing it as well. And once you're sharing it, then people who've already had eyes on your work and read your work will then look at what she's producing, and then that will start getting the ball rolling for her as well, which will be a really nice thing. So at least she's got you to almost mentor her in a way through it, because you've done this. You've published a couple of books now. You kind of come into grips with how everything works, I'm guessing, and you seem pretty confident in everything. So that must be a really big help.
Yeah, there's been a lot of pathfinding, I guess you might call it, right? Where
Yeah.
I had to do a lot of struggling figuring out, okay, who's the best person to go through for self-publishing? Where do I find this cover artist, right?
Yeah.
And so trailblazing, I guess, might be the better word for it. But yeah, we're laying some groundwork there, and
Yeah.
I've been growing more confident in my process. And I say, okay, we've got 2 books under our belt. We know pretty much exactly what we're doing for the third and the fourth, and so on from here
Hmm.
on out. And so yeah, it's a process that's just gonna keep building here.
And that's the main thing, isn't it? Especially if you're an indie author, you're always going to be finding things that you might want to tweak, but you have the general gist of the lay of the land. So that's going to be a lot more reassuring, probably, as Summer releases her books as well, which is lovely to hear.
Mhm.
So, with that in mind, obviously, and you getting all this together, the plan is cover artist in February, and then does she have like a planned date to start releasing, or are you just taking it as it comes?
Yeah, I think it's more take it as we come. And I've again kind of found this with my own work, right?
Hmm.
When I got later into writing Godfrey's Crusade, uh, I could fairly consistently, at least for a little while, say, okay, here's how many words I can plug into a chapter in a night. Here's how many nights it takes to finish a chapter. Here's how
Hmm.
many chapters I've got planned, right? And so at one point, I had this calculation where I said, okay, I should be done with the first draft by X day.
Yeah.
Well, then life happened
And
and things slowed down and said, oh, and I readjusted that calculation, and then more life happened, right? And
yeah,
so I think one of the struggles of starting out as an indie author is that it just always takes longer than what you want it to, right?
yeah,
Um, you think of the guys who are able to do this full time, and it's like, okay, yeah, you've got 8 hours in your day to just work on books, and
hmm,
then errands and family and all that stuff can happen afterwards, right?
yeah,
But when you're in my wife and I spot where we're still newish to this and we can't quite let go of the day jobs yet,
yeah.
most of what we do happens on nights and weekends. And if it's a bad day, sometimes you just stare at that screen and nothing happens, right? So
Well, yeah,
yeah.
and obviously, like you said, life gets in the way as well, and with families and all that, and families and jobs and stuff, it can be really difficult to kind of just even carve out that time for yourself, let alone to do the hobby that you're pursuing. So it's
Mhm.
really admirable that you've managed to do it, and you've got 2 books here. They're physically in hands and in people's phones, listening to them and reading them on ebooks. So that's just, I couldn't do it. I'm
Oh yeah.
always in awe of like indie authors, especially because, like I said, you guys, you do it all yourselves, and obviously you get help with different elements, but at the end of the day, you are marketing you and your books.
Mhm.
So it's really impressive.
Yeah, and the most important thing, right, is to carve out some time every day, right? Even if it's just that 1 hour right before going to bed, if you can carve out just a little bit of time every
Mhm.
day, that's so much better than waiting for this like 8 hour stretch that just isn't going to materialize, right?
Yeah.
Um, as I've talked with people about my books and have tried to promote myself, right, I've met a lot of other writers out there who are, a little bit farther behind than me, right, where they say, oh, I've always wanted to write a book and I've got this idea in my head.
Mm.
And I always tell them, just what we said here, right? Put in a little bit of time every day and
Yeah.
you're going to eventually get there, right? Whether it takes a year or 5 years or 10 years, you're eventually going to get there if
Mhm.
you put in the time every day.
Oh, 100%. And sometimes that's the hardest thing, but that is true. Like if you put the effort in, you will eventually have a finished manuscript or song or video or anything. It's similar advice to what I give to people who ask about starting channels and stuff. It's like, well,
Mhm.
sometimes you get really lucky and you hit the right algorithm, or you find the right group of people and you shoot up and you get all these like views and subscribers and stuff, and that's fantastic. And sometimes it just takes us a little bit longer, but as long as you're putting in the work and you're enjoying what you're doing, because that's the main thing, people can tell when you're not enjoying what you're doing. It's the same with writing. As a reader reading something, if you can tell that the author is not into it, you're not going to be into it. Like, as long as you are still interested and you are passionate about the subject or whatever you're talking about, people will still come and read and watch or consume whatever you're putting out because you are passionate and they also feel that passion.
Mhm. Yeah, no, there's definitely some people out there who say, "Oh, I want to be a famous author." It's
Mm,
like, okay, that's good, but what do you want to write? And
yeah.
then they say, "Oh, I don't know, but I want to be a famous writer." Right? Yeah,
You
find
need
the
the product.
idea that you're passionate about. Yeah, have the product, right?
Hmm.
Find what makes you get excited, and that's ultimately going to sell a lot better than uh, something you just spin out of the press
Hmm.
and just hope to make money off of it, right?
Well,
So,
exactly. And I would say that that's obviously my biggest advice to anyone for anything is, if you are passionate and you put it out there, you will attract the audience of which that you're looking for, because it's there. There are people out there looking for the Godfrey Crusades of the world, and people are out there looking for it. They will find you. And I really do think that people have found you. I mean, obviously, the books are out. There are people out there, me included, who want to experience more of this world and just learn more about the characters. The idea of a prequel series is really exciting as well. I love finding out more about characters when I'm invested, especially because you want to know where they've come from and what's kind of inspired them to be the way they are. And I think that's really interesting, and it's really lovely that it's you and your wife making that content for people to consume as well.
yeah, yeah, uh, it's an incredible journey here, and I've just been blown away at how successful we've become in this
Mm.
time. I mean, obviously, we're not the J.K. Rowlings or George R. R. Martins of the world yet, but
There's
um,
still time.
there's still plenty of time, right?
Exactly.
But
Is that the plan, to become full-time authors, or is it always just something you'd like to keep more as a hobby?
um, I think it would be absolutely fantastic if one day we did hit the point where we could sell books consistently enough to do it full time.
Yeah.
But if not, I have a minimum goal to at least complete Godfrey's series, right?
Mhm.
I've got enough fans out there and I've got enough self drive to say, I've got to finish what I started, right?
Yeah.
And so at minimum, I plan on seeing Godfrey's series completed. Uh, I can't imagine myself dropping writing altogether. I think
Mhm.
that once Godfrey's series is completed, that there will be some future work that's already kicking in the back of my mind here that will be starting up shortly after Godfrey's series is done.
Yeah.
And so it's just a matter of how long do I need to keep the day job while still writing, right?
Yeah, well, that's fantastic to think about as well. It's the fact that you've got a goal and you're working towards it. For some people, writing or whatever their passion is, they're quite happy to just have it as an extra. That's like
Mhm.
me. I'm quite happy to keep like this as an extra. I love doing it. I would love to have more time to read all of the books in the world and everything, but I don't think I could continuously just be as excited if it was my full-time gig. Maybe that would change if I experienced that. But I love meeting people who are like, this is my dream. I want this to be my full-time gig. I want this to be everything. And just being able to dedicate all of that time to that craft is so inspirational for a lot of people, I'm sure. I'm sure it's not just me.
Yeah, yeah. No, there's definitely, I think that a lot of people who land the dream job, right, whatever that is, whether it's
Mhm.
movie star, author, whatever the case may be, I think there is a little bit of the reality that sets in where now it's like, okay, now I have to publish, right?
Yeah.
And so there is a bit of a downside to that. And anything that you love could become a chore once we start attaching this obligation side to it, right?
Mhm.
And so there is that, but um, I've had a little bit of dabbling to a certain degree into what it's like to be a full-time author uh, through my years of being a teacher, right? Teaching
Mhm.
in the US, uh, you're in the classroom for 9 months out of the year, and then you have summer break for 2.5-ish to 3 months of the year.
Yeah.
And when I would have those summer breaks, I would treat writing as the full-time job, right? I would wake up early, I
Mhm.
would go out the door and find some coffee shop or a Barnes and Noble, a bookstore, something like that, and I would just plug away at the laptop for that 8 hours, come home for dinner, and then do it all again the next day, right?
Yeah.
And what I found from that experience of doing it for at least a 3 month stretch at a time was that it's like, I love this, right?
Well, that's
I
the main
want to
thing.
keep doing
It's that drive that is, like I said, so inspirational to see and to meet people who are like, I could just do this all day, every day. Like that's fantastic. Like that idea of finding the thing that is you that you want to do for the rest of however long you want to work, it's really inspirational because some people never find it. That's the thing.
it. Oh yeah, certainly. I mean, I know plenty of people who the job is what helps them get to their weekend, and their weekend is their 2 days to go to the beach or whatever, and then
Mhm.
they spend the next 5 days after that hating life, right? And so
Yeah.
that's a uh, I don't think most of us want to be there, but I think it's where a lot of us unfortunately find ourselves, right? Because again, the reality is most of us do have these uh, more mundane day jobs, and we need things like fantasy books to give us that escapism.
Yeah, and I need to work in order to afford to buy my books, so I have to go
Right,
to
yeah.
work. Although there is a running joke with me and my partner that I'm like, he needs to, bless him, he works so hard anyway. So I was like, you just need to work a little bit harder because then I can just stay at home. I can read my books. You can afford my addiction. And he's like, no, I can't do that.
Yeah.
Well, maybe one
Oh
day.
gosh. Yeah.
But I am aware that I have been chatting to you for well over an hour. So thank you so much for joining me, Mark, on all of these questions. And I that was really, I just love meeting authors that are, like I said before, so passionate about what they do and passionate about what they write. And you are that. You embody everything that you probably should be as an indie author as well, because you're just so excited to share your work with people in all of the different formats. So thank you so much for joining me. Do you want to do a little spiel where people can find you, what they can find you on, all of
Oh,
that?
sure. Yeah, no, again, it's been a great pleasure being here. So, there's a lot of different ways to contact me, right? So I'm on X was Twitter. I'll never get comfortable calling it X,
I
but
still call
anyway,
it Twitter.
I yeah, I have to stop myself. It's like Twitter X. Okay, yeah. But I'm on X. I'm on Facebook. Uh, my author website is Gathering Dust. You can always shoot me an email on www.thegriffinlegends.com. That's actually the series title of Godfrey's saga there, The Griffin Legends. So www.thegriffinlegends.com. Please send me a message on social media or on my author website. I love hearing from fans, right? It just makes my day to hear someone who says, "Oh, I'm really interested in your books," or "Oh, I read it and I loved it," or even, "Oh, I read your book and I think you could have done this and that better."
Yeah,
I getting feedback is a good thing, right? So I
as long as it's constructive and not mean, yes.
oh gosh, yeah, yeah. I saw one review on, not to extend our time too much longer here because
Okay.
I know we all got to go, but I saw one review on Amazon not too long ago where it's like 1 star out of 5, worst thing ever written, not worth the paper it was printed on. I'm like, oh, that makes me sad. But you also didn't tell me how to make it better, so
Oh yeah,
yeah.
but also I feel like when you get a 1 star review, a lot of, especially a lot of indie authors, they kind of like, obviously it's got to be hurtful, but they do try and make light of it, and they're like, oh, I've made it now because I'm getting hate, which means people are reading my book whether they are enjoying it or not. But you still read it, so thank you very much.
Right, right. I looking at the reviews on Amazon, right? I say if Sophocles, one of the greatest playwrights ever, can get 1 star reviews on Amazon, anyone can, right?
Right, exactly.
I think I did a good job on my books. Obviously, not everyone's going to think that. Maybe it's for you, maybe it's not for you, but hey, I really like it, and I'll take that constructive feedback where I can, and hopefully make the next book better.
Exactly, and that's the main thing. But yeah, thank you so much for joining me, Mark. It's been lovely. Thank you to anyone who is watching live, and if you're watching this back, thank you very much. I will link Mark after this live is finished. I will link Mark's Twitter X below and the website as well, so you can find him easier. And yeah, I hope you all have a lovely day, and I will be back with something new soon, I'm sure. And Mark will go back to writing.
Yeah, sounds great. All right, thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Bye.